We Presbyterians may be the only ones left who, when we say the Lord's Prayer in English, we say it the way it is recorded in the Bible. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Most other English translations of the Lord's Prayer, of course, use the terms trespasses and those who trespass against us. We owe this to William Tyndale, who first translated the Bible into English in 1526 and who translated the Greek word for debt as trespass. It was his translation that made its way into the 1549 Anglican Book of Common Prayer, even though the King James Version of the Bible reverted to debts and debtors. Tyndale's mistranslation notwithstanding, the metaphor of sin as a debt is so deeply rooted in the Bible and in the Old Testament that we cannot underestimate its importance in shaping the Church's understanding of the very nature of sin. For better and for worse, the debt metaphor has shaped our understanding of sin right up to today. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Friday, October 24th, 2025. Gary Anderson, an Old Testament scholar from the University of Notre Dame, has written an excellent book on the history of the idea of sin and how the metaphors for sin changed through the centuries in which the Old Testament books were written. So far, we've seen how he identifies the metaphors of sin as a burden and sin as a stain. But most of his book concerns the idea of sin as a debt. Now, without going too far into the scholarly weeds here, there was a sister language to Hebrew called Aramaic. In the centuries after the Babylonian exile, most Jews spoke Aramaic as their first language, leaving Hebrew primarily for priests and rabbis. The reason this is important is that when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Aramaic, the primary metaphor of sin as a burden was translated into Aramaic as debt. It is also important because Aramaic was the language of Jesus and his disciples. So when Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray in what we know as the Lord's Prayer, he teaches them in his native Aramaic, using the word for debt as the primary metaphor for sin. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. But it's not just the Lord's Prayer. Notice how many times Jesus refers to debts in his parables. For example, when Peter asks how often he has to forgive others, Jesus responds with a parable about a landowner who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. One approached him asking for time to repay, but when the landowner graciously gives him time, that servant went and demanded that another fellow servant settle the debt he owed to the first servant. But when the second servant also asked for time to pay, the first servant had the second one thrown into the debtor's prison. Jesus uses the image of sin as a debt to be repaid, even to talk about forgiveness. Then there's the parable of the two servants who both owe a master but different amounts. Jesus tells this parable to explain the actions of a prostitute who washed his feet, while the Pharisees questioned why he would allow such a woman even to touch him. In response, Jesus tells the parable of the two debtors, one who owes 500 denarii and one who owes 50. When they could not pay, says Jesus, the master canceled the debts for both of them. Now Jesus poses the question to the Pharisees: which of them will love him more? The obvious answer is the one who owed more. His point, obviously, is that we are all sinners, including the Pharisees, but the sins of the prostitute seem greater than the more mundane sins of people like the Pharisees. When greater sins are forgiven, it causes the forgiven one to be more grateful. We continue to use this metaphor in a variety of ways, even today. For example, we say to someone who has done us a big favor, "I owe you a debt of gratitude." We don't mean that we literally owe them some sum of money, only that we are extremely grateful. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that we actually owe them anything to reciprocate. Yes, we often do try to do a kindness in return or send them a little gift, but it is not a debt in the formal, legal sense of the word. Theoretically, the same thing holds true for sins. We don't use the metaphor of sin as debt in the formal, legal sense of something someone actually has to repay us. But in the history of the faith, this metaphor did lead to a kind of legalism that perhaps was not originally intended. By that I mean people began to reason that if sin is a debt, then it can be repaid like any other debt. And in what currency? In the currency of good works. And that, for Paul, for example, was right out. When we return tomorrow, we'll explore how the metaphor of sin as a debt resulted in forms of what have come to be regarded as works righteousness. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.